Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Ko Stuart Diamond Takawengawa, ko au te kaitohu tohu mā tāmua o he pouarangi. Good evening, everyone, and a warm welcome to this Zoom session. My name is Stuart Diamond. I'm a Chief Advisor here at the Climate Change Commission and will be the MC for this online Zoom session tonight. Shortly, the Chair of the Commission, Dr. Rod Carr, and its Chief Executive, Joe Hendy, will present the Climate Change Commission's Draft Emissions Reduction Plan Advice 2023. Before we get started, a reminder for all participants that this session will be recorded and made available on the Commission's website from tomorrow. With limited time tonight, the Zoom will be a presentation only, and there will be no opportunity for questions or comments. However, there are a number of online events running through the next few weeks where you can ask questions. And of course, there will be opportunities to have your say on the draft advice throughout the consultation period. You'll find the details of upcoming events and how to make a submission on the Commission's website, and we'll provide further details at the end of this presentation. To introduce the session today, what we will cover is going to be in three parts. First, the context for change. Secondly, low emission options. And thirdly, creating an enabling environment for lasting change. But before we go through the content of the draft advice, I'd like to now hand over to Dr. Rod Carr, Chair of the Climate Change Commission, to talk about the role of the Commission. Rod, over to you.
Ina mana, ina iwi, tēnā koutou katoa, ko Rod Carr aho. Kai whakahaere, hei Pouarangi Climate Change Commission. Good evening, everybody, and thank you for making the time and creating the opportunity for the Commission to present our draft advice and proposed recommendations in respect of New Zealand's emission reduction plan for the period 2026 to 2030. I say again that what we're proposing in the way of recommendations and the advice that we have drafted is available for contemplation and consultation over the next 8 weeks. We are seeking additional evidence that we can use to inform our advice to the government of the day. We are seeking perspectives on how our transition to a low emissions, thriving and climate resilient society can best be progressed. Unlike the circumstances surrounding the production of our first advice, Aotearoa New Zealand, we now have emissions budgets in place. Budgets which, in the opinion of the Commission, if achieved, support our progress towards the statutory targets that have been put in place. But the Commission's conclusion is that while progress is being made, we need to pick up the pace. We need to make sure that policy settings reduce the barriers and encourage the enablers for the reduction of emissions of all gases from all sources with urgency if we are to achieve the emissions budgets that we need to achieve in order to meet our targets. It's important to understand that while there are many pathways our economy and society could take, the end of the day, it is for our elected leaders to choose a path and put New Zealand on it. Our advice is high level. It is on the direction of policy that would help support accelerating the pace. We've established criteria so that we could give advice on the highest priority, most urgent policy that would be most likely to get the outcomes which we have already agreed New Zealand needs to achieve. That framework for prioritisation is also open for your commentary and advice. To walk you through each of the 19 recommendations that the Commission has made is our Chief Executive, Joe Hendy. Joe, over to you.
Thank you, Rod, and kia ora koutou. So I'm going to take you through a whistle-stop tour of our draft advice that we're consulting on. The Commission was created in 2019 with the passing of the Zero Carbon Bill, amending the Climate Change Response Act. Our roles under this Act are varied, and the factors we must consider are detailed and specific. The Act requires the Commission to consider the Crown Māori relationship, Te Ao Māori, and specific effects on iwi Māori in all the advice it gives to government. Some of our core considerations in the Act include distributional effects, including intergenerational, economic effects, social, cultural, and environmental circumstances. The Commission is an independent Crown entity with an advisory role within the wider system for climate change policy in Aotearoa New Zealand. We provide regular, independent, and evidence-based advice to government on climate action, and we monitor progress towards our climate goals. As part of this, we assess the adequacy of government action and share our conclusions publicly. The conclusions and recommendations of the Commission are made by our board, not a government minister or cabinet. These conclusions and recommendations are founded on the science, evidence, and analysis carried out by our experts on staff, and importantly, based on input from stakeholders and the people of Aotearoa New Zealand. The Commission's focus has been on providing advice on ways forward that are effective, equitable, practical, and affordable. Our legislation guides us to consider both ambition and achievability. We provide advice that enables Aotearoa New Zealand to earn its way in the world, and that supports future pathways that are fair, responsible, and sustainable. It is important that these pathways do not broaden current inequalities. Rather, our pathways forward need to work alongside efforts to address other wellbeing challenges, like healthy housing, urban form, the future of transport, and the state of our natural environment. We know the transition to a low emissions and climate resilient society will bring a mix of opportunities, benefits, challenges, and costs, and the effects, good and bad, will be felt by us all. At the core of the transition is people. Ultimately, it is people in communities, people in business, and people on the ground who are the ones who will act to reduce our emissions and adapt us to climate change. The Climate Change Commission was established to support this transition. We are consulting on our draft advice to government on the direction of policy for actions New Zealand must take to meet its climate goals and address climate change. It is then the role of the government of the day to decide on the specific policy choices to put in the emissions reduction plan. We understand that people are at the heart of policy. It's important that our advice reflects what Kiwis are experiencing and care about. Having input from people is vitally important to us. Consultation is a chance for us to share our thinking and for people to submit on what we have said in our draft advice. We want to know if you think our recommendations reflect what you think is the correct path New Zealand should be taking to reduce emissions and meet our legislated targets. We look forward to receiving your submissions. At the end of this webinar, we'll cover how you can make a submission and also note that this information is on our website. Once we have incorporated what we've heard, our final advice is due to the Minister of Climate Change by the 31st of December of this year. The second emissions budget covers 2026 to 2030 and has been set. Now government needs a plan to deliver on it. Because the government now has its first emissions reduction plan in place, this draft advice that we are consulting on is focused on building on the work already progressing. Our work includes identifying where critical gaps might exist and where existing actions might need to be strengthened and accelerated to achieve the second emissions budget and the country's longer-term climate goals. Reflecting that there is already much climate action underway, the Commission's draft advice has fewer recommendations than our previous advice in 2021. We have looked at how emissions pricing is likely to drive change. For each sector and across the broader system, we have identified where barriers currently deter low emissions choices and where strategic investment can help drive deeper change over the long term. This draft advice builds on the evidence base we have created through our previous work. We have also gathered and analysed data and evidence from a wide range of credible sources and reviewed a broad range of literature to support developing this draft advice. We have used both quantitative and qualitative tools to guide our analysis and test the quality of our evidence, refining it along the way. The Commission has used two frameworks to help formulate our advice. The first has helped us to prioritise which elements of our advice to raise as proposed recommendations. For context, there are around 400 government actions underway as part of the first emissions reduction plan, and a variety of other emissions reducing actions are being undertaken by other Kiwis around the country. We have prioritised our draft against 6 aspects that are each critical to consider. First, the potential for how the action can help New Zealand meet the second emissions budget and beyond, taking into account scale, scientific evidence, technology, economic feasibility and cost. Second, any gaps in the policy that would help support the action. Third, the pace and timing of the action. Will the pace be sufficient to contribute to the second emissions budget, or is it critical for laying the foundations for achieving future emissions budgets and targets? What are the risks to realising its potential and other risks associated with action? Equity considerations, including intergenerational equity and distributional effects on sectors, regions and social groups, and issues relevant to the Crown Māori relationship, Te Ao Māori, and specific effects on iwi Māori. And finally, what co-benefits does the action bring? For example, to health, wellbeing, economic development, other environmental or ecological factors. These aspects are all distilled from the matters that we are required to consider under our Act. As part of this consultation, we are seeking feedback on the prioritisation framework we have used, and we are also seeking feedback on how we have put it into action and used it to develop our draft recommendations. We have also used our policy framework pictured here to help us assess what types of policies or the direction of policy needed to support the priority actions. We have considered critical gaps in the current policy landscape, potential for co-benefits and wellbeing aspects. Through the passing of the Zero Carbon Bill in 2019, the country has set itself the target to reach net zero emissions for long-lived climate-damaging gases by 2050. Long-lived gases are gases such as carbon dioxide, released when people burn fossil fuels, and nitrous oxide, released, for example, through synthetic fertiliser use. Similar to other countries all over the world, the target is a net target, and forestry can play a significant role in getting us there. As forests grow, they remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and so can help balance our climate-damaging emissions. Net zero by 2050 means that the long-lived gases emitted in 2050 must fully balance with the carbon dioxide removed from the atmosphere in that year, and the country must sustain this balance in the decades that follow. There are different ways of getting to the net zero target and staying there. One option is to focus solely on net emissions and let the lowest price fully determine the mix of carbon removals and emissions reductions. In the work the Commission did in 2021, the Ngāia Tonu Nei, we ran a number of scenarios, and this approach was one of them. In that work, we found that the country could get to net zero with a low emissions price. But we also identified some major consequences of this strategy. Under this scenario, the country would almost solely rely on forestry to do the heavy lifting. In 2050, New Zealand would still have a high emissions economy and would continue to need to convert more and more land to forestry to sustain net zero in the following decades. The Commission's draft advice today is that this is a high-risk strategy. We propose that a much less risky course of action is to have a strategy that focuses on both reducing emissions at source, avoiding them whenever feasible, and acknowledging that forests are an important part of our journey to get there. Forests are part of the answer, not the entire answer. Storing carbon in forests is not risk-free. It locks land use into the future, and it can create ongoing issues for local communities. And if it comes at the expense of reducing emissions at source, we will continue to build emissions-intensive infrastructure, locking in high emissions pathways into the future. This is an area where we think it is important for government to be clear on their objective, because ongoing uncertainty around this issue will have costs, with investors being hesitant about making investments. And this uncertainty will compound. The net emissions budgets in place today, out to 2035, are foundational to getting on the path to the country's long-term targets. Being clear on the objective will reduce investment uncertainty and help set the direction of policy. So, the proposed recommendation we are consulting on is that government commit to a specific level of gross emissions for the second and third emissions budgets and ensure that its policy choices align with delivering this outcome. And that the government communicate indicative levels of gross emissions and carbon dioxide removals from forestry out to 2050 and beyond to guide policy development. The New Zealand Emissions Trading Scheme, the ETS, is a key tool to drive climate action to meet the emissions budgets and the 2050 target. But the ETS is a tool, not a strategy, and it needs to be tuned to achieve the objectives we are seeking. As it is currently structured, there is a high risk that supply of units will overtake demand for units by the late 2030s. The consequence of this would be severe downward pressure on the emissions price with impactful knock-on effects. And the emissions price would no longer be able to drive action towards the net zero target for long-lived gases. One of the pillars of driving climate action in New Zealand may fall over before the country reaches its 2050 target. The ETS is currently tuned to drive extensive afforestation over the next 10 years or so, rather than reduce emissions of climate-damaging gases at source. And in 15 years or so, there is a high risk that the ETS will fail to provide the incentives for forestry needed to reach net zero if prices fall due to excess supply of units. If the country is to sustain incentives for both sequestration from forests and emissions reductions, the government needs to start working out how to do this now. This is because the forestry sector makes investments decisions with a long-term horizon. Iwi Māori have a significant stake in the NZ ETS. Any government processes and decisions about amending the NZ ETS must recognise the rights of iwi Māori and uphold Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi, and make sure impacts for Māori collective landowners and iwi Māori foresters are understood and properly considered. So, the proposed recommendations we are consulting on are that government make the emissions pricing system consistent with delivering the specified levels of gross emissions for the second and third budgets and with the 2050 net zero target by implementing an amended NZ ETS that separates the incentives for gross emissions reductions from those applying to forestry, and developing an approach that can provide durable incentives for net carbon dioxide removals by forests through to and beyond 2050. The Climate Change Response Act is clear. Government must consider the role iwi Māori play in our emissions reductions both now and in the future. In the advice the Commission gives to government, the Commission must consider the Crown Māori relationship, te ao Māori, and specific effects on iwi Māori. These are mandatory. Globally, Indigenous leadership is creating climate solutions that are grounded in the guardianship of the natural environment and the connection between the well-being of people and the environment. Tangata whenua, as rangatira and kaitiaki, show climate leadership grounded in tikanga and mataranga Māori. This benefits iwi Māori and all New Zealanders. The country needs to find ways to accelerate action on climate change, and do this in a way that gives effect to Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi. This will require resourcing, and in our draft advice, we have identified the need for the government to explore ways to invest directly in iwi hapu and increase funding to Māori landowners to accelerate emissions reductions in a way consistent with the principles of Te Tiriti, the treaty. Alongside this, Mataranga Māori can contribute to climate action, but requires resourcing of iwi Māori-led research, development and deployment into the climate response. This will support an equitable transition for iwi Māori for now and generations to come. When iwi Māori have access to the right tools and mechanisms, they can decide what approach to climate change and emissions reductions is best for the protection of their taonga, in a manner consistent with their aspirations and right to exercise rangatiratanga. So, the proposed recommendations we are consulting on are that the government accelerate iwi Māori emissions reductions in conjunction with climate change adaptation initiatives by exploring and implementing a mechanism to allocate resourcing direct to iwi and increase funding to the Māori landowners, te ture whenua entities, and ensure iwi Māori can drive the integration of Mataranga Māori into policy design, development and implementation at central and local government level by delivering sufficient resources to iwi hapu. The climate change transition will bring opportunities and challenges for everyday Kiwis. This includes the opportunities and challenges that come from reducing emissions from our everyday activities, and the challenges that come from increasingly severe and frequent climate extremes. There is clear evidence that acting on climate change has significant co-benefits. For example, reduced air pollution, sufficient building insulation, and clean heating can all improve the health of our kids, whānau, and communities. And the transition to low emissions is an opportunity to reduce ongoing costs faced by households. However, some people face barriers to taking up the options to reduce their emissions that prevent them from realising these cost savings. In the near term, changes in the New Zealand ETS prices would flow through to households. For lower income households, our analysis estimates that a $50 increase in the NZ ETS price could result in an average increase in weekly household spending by around $3.30 per week. This is about 0.6% of disposable income. There are many quick and straightforward options for the government to manage these types of impacts. For example, the Winter Energy Payment is one scheme intended to help those who may be impacted by higher energy costs over the winter. Transitioning to a low emissions economy will grow job opportunities in low emissions sectors, while at the same time reducing the need for workers in high emissions sectors. While New Zealand has a flexible labour market, support may be needed for those who need to retrain or relocate. The government is currently working on an equitable transition strategy. If the country is to proactively manage the transition, the strategy needs to be implemented in a timely manner. The government can also take actions to address impacts while it is being developed. Delaying action on emissions reductions to wait for the strategy poses significant risks to meeting our emissions budgets and targets. The scope of the strategy is currently focused through only one climate lens: emissions reductions. The country needs to be planning for both climate emissions reductions and adapting to climate change together, so that decisions that are made that focus on both goals. In many cases, the groups of people at greatest risk of experiencing inequitable impacts from climate change and from policy to address it and adapt to it are the same. A proactive, well-supported, well-signalled transition gives our industries, regions and communities the best chance of taking advantage of the changing employment opportunities, overcoming challenges and building resilience. So, the proposed recommendations we are consulting on are that government enable a fair, inclusive and equitable transition for New Zealanders by expanding the scope of the equitable transition strategy to include compounding impacts of climate change and adaptation as well as mitigation, and make use of existing mechanisms to manage impacts of climate policies in the interim rather than delaying action. Through the passing of the Zero Carbon Bill, the country set targets for biogenic methane reduction in addition to the net zero target for long-lived gases. This includes a target for at least a 10% reduction over 2017 levels by 2030. Our main sources of biogenic methane emissions are from agriculture and waste, and reduction in emissions for both these sectors will be essential for meeting the 2030 methane target. The options for reducing farm emissions are rapidly developing, and if we are to take advantage of these, we need to quickly get our house in order so we can rapidly deploy them. This means having incentives up and running, streamlining deployment processes, and getting ahead of potential roadblocks around regulations, and making training and information available to make uptake faster and easier. Part of this is underway, with the government in the last stages of designing the agricultural pricing system. But 2030 is only 7 years away. Actions in these areas need to be a critical priority for government in the second emissions reduction plan to minimise the risk of missing the 2030 methane target. At the same time, government needs to be looking at building the resilience of our agricultural sector in the face of increasingly chaotic climatic events and changing customer expectations on the global stage. So, the proposed recommendations we are consulting on are that government enhance advisory and extension services to farmers to enable them to respond to pricing and accelerate the adoption of emissions-efficient practices, appropriate land use diversification, and emerging technologies to reduce gross emissions. These services should be co-designed and implemented in partnership with industry and iwi Māori. And the government needs to advance the agricultural emissions pricing system to enable recognition of a broader range of emissions reducing practices and technologies, and incentivise gross emissions reductions in line with the 2050 target. Infrastructure is a critical part of the solution to reducing emissions and adapting to climate change. This includes how buildings, the infrastructure that supports them, and the transport systems that help people get around are designed and built. It also includes where they are built. Evolving our built environment will take time. Decisions made today might have a small impact in the short term, but benefits will snowball as we near our long-term targets. The government is currently reforming the planning system, and it's important they take the time to get a good system in place. While this is underway, the Commission has proposed some straightforward, low regrets actions that government can take that will make it much easier to meet the longer term emissions targets. This includes scaling up efforts to retrofit existing buildings to be healthier, more resilient, and lower emissions. New Zealand has a history of cold, damp, and unhealthy houses, and tackling this problem has multiple benefits. This also includes restricting new installations of fossil gas in buildings where there are alternatives available. This is not about starting a culture war with barbecuers or putting restaurants out of business. This is about heating space and water in buildings where viable and economic alternatives exist. Like many businesses, gas infrastructure companies are actively looking at ways to reduce their carbon footprint. And fossil gas will continue to have a role to play in our industry in the near term. However, gas infrastructure is regulated to protect consumers because it is provided by natural monopolies. Restricting new installations will break the cycle of gas-fired technology lock-in, safeguard consumers from higher costs, and improve health by reducing indoor air pollution. Government regulators could revisit this restriction if lower emissions gas options become economic and available at scale. So, the proposed recommendations we are consulting on are that government implement an integrated planning system that builds urban areas upward and mixes uses while incrementally reducing climate risks, and incentivise comprehensive retrofits to deliver healthy, resilient, low emissions buildings, and prohibit the new installation of fossil gas in buildings where there are affordable and technically viable low emissions alternatives in order to safeguard consumers from the costs of locking in new fossil gas infrastructure. The energy and industrial sectors provide the greatest opportunities for reducing emissions in the second emissions budget period. Indeed, rapidly reducing industrial emissions is crucial for meeting the second emissions budget. One of the main opportunities comes from electrification, building more solar, wind, and geothermal electricity generation, and using it to displace coal and fossil gas use in process heat and transport. Biomass also has a role to play in the clean energy transition, and there are potentially some opportunities around low emissions gases such as biogas and hydrogen. There is a wave of energy policy development currently underway. The government committed to developing an energy strategy in its first emissions reduction plan to provide long-term direction for an energy system transition. The government will also need to tackle policy uncertainty and regulatory constraints that are introducing delay to bringing new renewable electricity generation online. Delaying building renewable electricity can directly and indirectly increase emissions. For example, the Commission estimates that a delay of a year would increase emissions on average by around 2 megatons of CO2e across the second emissions budget period. As well as accelerating renewable electricity build, it's also important to make sure local lines companies are able to support growth and the variability of supply and demand. Fossil gas will begin to transition out of the system this decade, but will remain important for the security of electricity supply and some industrial users through the second emissions budget period and beyond. In our draft, we have flagged to government that they may have overestimated in the first emissions reduction plan how quickly emissions reductions from process heat can be achieved. The government's upper estimate would require all coal, all fossil gas, and all diesel industrial boilers to have been converted to electricity or biomass by 2025, 2 years away. This is likely to be unachievable. As well as process heat, other opportunities could be pursued, such as large industrial users and chemical production. The technology for industries with hard-to-abate emissions is still developing, and government could look at what the role of policy is to accelerate this. So, the proposed recommendations we are consulting on are that government prioritise and accelerate renewable electricity generation builds and ensure electricity distribution networks can support growth and variability in supply and demand, and pursue more widespread process heat decarbonisation, and establish mechanisms for other industrial sectors and processes to decarbonise. Forestry has an important role to play in helping the country meet its long-lived gas targets by removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and storing it on land. Forests also can make a significant contribution through the bioeconomy. Forests can provide other benefits as well, such as enhanced biodiversity, better water quality, and reduced erosion. However, forests also face risks of fire, storm damage, and pests, which will be exacerbated by a changing climate. An over-reliance on the balancing effect of carbon removed from the atmosphere by forests could make maintaining the net zero emissions beyond 2050 more difficult. There are also impacts on local communities that come with this approach. Harnessing these benefits and managing the risks involves being clear on the role of forestry. This is important so that policies targeting these different aspects can be designed to work well together and not in conflict. The role of forestry needs to be thought about in relation to the bioeconomy, biodiversity, water quality, soil health, and resiliency through the lens of what type of forestry is suitable where for what purpose. Iwi Māori need to be an integral part of the conversation on the role of forestry due to their unique connection with the forestry sector, including financial, cultural, and spiritual. Iwi Māori participate in the forestry sector at a range of levels, including being the forest owners, forest workers, and kaitiaki. Furthermore, forests act as a source of food, medicine, and building materials. So, the proposed recommendation the government is consulting on the proposed recommendation the Commission is consulting on is that the government set and implement integrated objectives for the role of forest with respect to emissions mitigation and adaptation, while giving effect to the principles of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi. The transport system is critical for connecting people, families, and communities, and for a thriving economy, but is a major and growing source of emissions. Action on transport will have a small impact in the short term that snowballs over the longer term. This lag effect means a strong focus on transport in the second emissions budget will be important for meeting the third emissions budget and staying on track for the 2050 target. Simplifying planning and increasing funding of integrated transport networks can optimise public and active transport. We are currently seeing increased uptake of electric vehicles. To achieve our future emissions budgets, this needs to continue and will likely be helped by global trends toward more competitive pricing and supply. However, this progress could be undermined if barriers are not addressed to scaling up both a nationwide public charging network and sufficient private charging capacity. The freight network is essential for a thriving economy, including enabling exports, but creates a quarter of transport emissions in Aotearoa New Zealand. There is significant potential for emissions reductions from transitioning trucks to zero or low emissions alternatives, which could be further incentivised. So, the proposed recommendations the Commission is consulting on are that the government simplify planning and increase funding of integrated transport networks that optimise public and active transport. For major population centres, the government should also complete cycleway networks by 2030 and take steps to complete rapid transport networks by 2035. And the government should rapidly resolve the barriers to scaling up vehicle charging infrastructure. And the government should develop incentives to accelerate the uptake of zero emissions commercial vehicles, including vans, utes, and trucks. Biogenic methane is a byproduct of decomposing organic waste in landfills, and reducing these waste emissions will be critical for achieving the 2030 methane target alongside reducing agricultural methane. Globally, solid waste management is estimated to account for approximately 5% of all emissions. New Zealand has high levels of waste per capita. For example, 2018 data shows that Kiwis produced nearly 50% more waste than the OECD average. Preventing waste in the first place is the most effective starting point. For the waste people do produce, waste infrastructure and resource recovery planning are important too. While the government has various work underway, a major gap we identified relates to improving performance of gas capture at landfills. While diverting organic waste from landfill will significantly reduce methane emissions, building the appropriate infrastructure to do so will take time. Reducing emissions from the waste currently in landfills and the waste to come will require improving gas capture. So, the proposed recommendations the Commission is consulting on are that the government apply regulatory and policy instruments to achieve the optimal use and efficiency of landfill gas capture systems and technologies at all landfills, and improve the accuracy and transparency of landfill gas capture data by reviewing and strengthening relevant regulatory and policy tools. The chapters that I'm going to cover now do not contain proposed recommendations. For this draft advice, our proposed recommendations are tightly focused on identifying and addressing critical gaps in areas requiring urgent strengthening and acceleration to achieve the second emissions budget and support the country's longer-term emissions reduction targets. Our prioritisation approach has not identified critical risks to achieving the second emissions budget in every sector. However, even in those sectors without recommendations, action is still important to create the conditions for future outcomes and to achieve emissions budgets and targets in a manner compliant with the matters in the Act. A strong research, science, innovation and technology system is fundamental to transformation. Targeted investment in climate change research and development and a clear set of priorities is needed. Timing is important because research and innovation do not happen overnight. Continuity of people, infrastructure, technology and information will ensure we have the right resources at the right time. Openly available climate change data and other relevant information is essential for the transition. To drive innovation, our regulatory environment needs to both enable and incentivise early adoption of low emissions technologies. Developing a strong digital economy will be necessary to support digitalisation across sectors and improve resiliency across the economy by supporting innovation. The government's funding and finance decisions will affect the country's journey to a low emissions future. While work is underway enabling and investing in a low emissions economy, meeting emissions reduction targets will depend on broadening, deepening and accelerating current efforts in both the public and private financial sectors. In addition to the direct impacts felt from individual projects or policies, government funding and finance decisions send a message about what is important to New Zealanders and demonstrate what kind of change is possible at a large scale. The role of private investment in decarbonisation is growing and requires an enabling environment from the government who can use opportunities like blended finance and tax incentives to accelerate uptake from private investors. As the climate changes, each year brings more negative impacts and higher costs caused by the increasing occurrence of floods, droughts, severe storms and forest fires. A coherent and coordinated approach to climate finance can help the country navigate the rising costs of adaptation while delivering on our targets. A fair, inclusive and equitable transition involves putting people at the centre of funding and finance. In many ways, Māori businesses are leading the way when it comes to integrated investment, frequently incorporating social, cultural and environmental goals, often through an intergenerational lens into their business analysis. A circular economy means keeping resources circulating in our economy for as long as possible, reducing emissions from extraction, manufacturing and waste. The bioeconomy is an example of the circular economy. It involves using wood and other plants to replace fossil fuels, plastics and materials with high embodied emissions. In the first emissions reduction plan, the government committed to commencing a circular economy and bioeconomy strategy. In our advice, we emphasise the importance of actively working with iwi Māori to take this forward, shifting the focus to delivery and implementation. We identify a range of areas that would help promote the transition to a more circular economy, including the need to reduce the embodied carbon of products, goods and services. To ensure that embodied emissions are accounted for, we need to bring them to the fore in decision making, and to do this, we need better data on embodied emissions at the materials level. We also identify the need for the government to set strategic prioritisation of biomass use, as use of bio feedstocks may be an opportunity to displace fossil fuels in some cases. The development of the bioeconomy would also benefit from removing barriers to innovation and promoting confidence in the bioeconomy. This could include updating standards to align with bioproducts and using government procurement to create demand for bioproducts. Meeting the emissions budgets requires concerted and timely action across all sectors. Pursuing a range of opportunities will give Aotearoa New Zealand the best chance to deliver on its emissions budgets and the 2050 target. To meet the second emissions budget, we anticipate the need for particularly large contributions from electricity generation and process heat. To meet the third emissions budget, we anticipate the need for particularly large contributions from transport. Seemingly small delays in the near term can lead to much higher cumulative emissions. Because changes like electrifying the country's vehicle fleet take time, the ability to meet the third emissions budget will be strongly determined by actions taken during the second emissions budget period. The government's first emissions reduction plan, if fully implemented, closes the gap somewhat to meeting future budgets, but further and stronger policies are likely needed. The government's latest emissions projections show progress, but a gap remains. Further and stronger policies are needed to get on track for emissions budget 2 and 3 and deliver the 2030 methane target. While the government's policy impact assessment suggested the policies under the first emissions reduction plan could achieve the second and third emissions budgets, our analysis highlights significant risks around some underlying assumptions and the plausibility of its high impact estimates. This graph shows emissions reductions expected across sectors spanning the first 3 emissions budgets. These figures represent the gap between the government's projected baseline emissions prior to the introduction of policies from the first emissions reduction plan and the sector sub-targets. In other words, this shows where further emissions reductions are expected to come from, beyond business as usual, to meet the first 3 emissions budgets. The figures we present here include adjustments for the Tiwai Point aluminium smelter remaining open. This increases projected energy and industry emissions. The reductions achievable in the first emissions budget period are relatively small, as it takes time to implement and scale up actions, and in many cases, further time for these to have meaningful impact on reducing emissions. For instance, the pace at which low carbon technologies can replace high emissions technologies is often limited by the rate assets are retired and other aspects such as workforce availability and capability. Low carbon infrastructure takes time to consent and build before it can be used. A newly planted forest absorbs little carbon dioxide initially, with the growth and absorption rate increasing over time to an eventual limit. These time lags and practical limits on the pace of change highlight the importance of prompt and decisive action to get on track for future emissions budgets and the 2050 target, as emissions reductions accumulate over time. A small delay to action can lead to much higher cumulative emissions. In green, we show a hypothetical action scaling up from 2022 to deliver a megatonne in annual emissions reductions by 2030. In dark orange, we show the same action delayed by 2 years. This figure shows the 2-year delay would more than halve the total emissions reductions delivered out to 2030. It also shows how what might appear to be a small shortfall in the first emissions budget could become a much larger shortfall in the second budget as the impacts of the delay accumulate and snowball. These examples hold important lessons for how the second emissions reduction plan will impact momentum for the third emissions budget period. The ability to meet the third emissions budget will be strongly determined by the actions taken before 2030. Likewise, meeting the second emissions budget depends on the key actions being taken in the next 2 years. And thank you very much for that. And now I'm going to hand back over to Stuart.
Thank you very much, Jo, for taking us through the draft advice from the Commission. And I hope that's been helpful for those of you online with us tonight. So what's next? Our consultation period is taking place from the 26th of April, that's today, through until the 20th of June. So that gives you a couple of months and others to offer your feedback and views on the draft advice that's come out today. After the consultation period is finished, we will be looking at all of the feedback that we receive, and the evidence and perspectives will be considered by the Commission as we develop our final advice, which will be provided to the government by the end of the year. As Jo made clear, the government of the day will then decide which parts of our advice will be made into policy and will make decisions after considering the advice that we've provided. So I'd like to offer just a few more comments on how to submit on the draft advice. A reminder again, the consultation runs from today, April the 26th, through until the 20th of June. The details for how to make a submission on the advice are available on our website, as is the advice, the draft advice itself. We look forward to hearing your evidence and perspectives in submissions. And a reminder that hearing directly from you and others in Aotearoa New Zealand helps us to ensure that our advice is relevant, that it is practical, and that it is achievable. You can stay in the loop on our consultation through the Commission's Twitter and also on LinkedIn. Thank you very much to all of you who have joined us tonight, and we look forward to your considering the draft advice that's come out today and to hearing from you in this consultation period. Thank you very much and good evening.